Welcome to our opening keynote. I hope everybody has had an engaging day and that this first day of our summit has really created meaningful opportunities for engagement, for thought, for partnership, as we engage in really critical conversations about advancing equity and inclusion in STEM. I was thinking a lot about Howard Gobstein's comments this morning, and they were powerful and thoughtful, and it really helped me think about and really reframe the importance of the conversation that we hope to have today with Dr. Shirley Malcom and Dr. Robert Jones. I'm reminded that as we try to move the needle of broadening participation in STEM, we have to be critically mindful of what's happening in our world, not only now, but being mindful of what's happened in our world historically. And as we look at our history, we must think critically about our progress and about our missteps if we're going to chart an effective path forward. So today we've selected two incredible scholars and leaders for our keynote, and I can't imagine two better people to lead us through this conversation and this critical reflection. So I'll start with introducing Dr. Shirley Malcom, who is Senior Advisor and Director of the Sea Change Project at AAAS. She works to improve the quality and increase access to education and careers in STEM fields, as well as to enhance public science literacy. Malcom is a native of Birmingham, Alabama, and she received her Ph.D. in ecology from the Pennsylvania State University, master's in zoology from UCLA, which is also my alma mater, and a Ph.D. From the Pennsylvania State University. She also has 16 honorary degrees. Dr. Malcom's accolades and achievements are numerous, but I'll share that she serves on multiple boards and is an international leader in STEM education with a focus on equity and justice. She's a former member of the National Science Board and served on President Clinton's Committee of Advisors on Science and Technology. In 2003, she received the Public Welfare Medal of the National Academy of Sciences, which is the highest award given by the Academy. So welcome, Dr. Malcom. And she is joined by Dr. Robert Jones, who became the 10th Chancellor of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in September of 2015. He is a Georgia native and earned his bachelor's degree in agronomy from Fort Valley State College, a master's degree from the University of Georgia, and a doctorate from the University of Missouri-Columbia. He began his career at the University of Minnesota, where he spent more than 3 decades as a distinguished faculty member and an academic leader. Chancellor Jones came to Illinois from the University of Albany, where he served as president from 2013 to 2016. Dr. Jones also has a long list of achievements, so let me just highlight a few. He serves on the board of directors for multiple organizations and has a well-documented commitment to equity and justice, marked by his work with Archbishop Desmond Tutu's South Africa's education program as an academic and a scientific consultant. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and is a fellow of the American Society of Agronomy and Crop Science Society of America. So welcome to our two panelists, and I couldn't be more excited for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. So as I mentioned, as some people were coming into the room, we will begin today's keynote with a facilitated conversation between Chancellor Jones and Dr. Malcom. But we do have a Q&A. After the facilitated conversation, we're really excited to move towards audience questions. So as we're moving through, please feel free to put questions into the Q&A. And also we have an upvote feature. So if you all in the audience, as you're seeing great questions from your colleagues, if you see a question that you really like as well, you can upvote that question, which will signal to our moderators kind of some audience polling. So, we hope you'll participate there as well. Drs. Malcom and Jones, I'm so excited to have you all with us. Thank you again for giving us some of your time today. And thank you both for also serving on Aspire's advisory board with our project. We really value your feedback as well as our other advisory members. I wanted to ask you, as we move into this facilitated discussion, if we might start with some introductory comments, given the especially poignant time that we currently find ourselves in. I know that when we were planning this keynote, we were really thinking a lot about how COVID-19 has been affecting institutional leaders and faculty across the country. And we were really thinking about how disruptions play into the work of diversity, equity, inclusion. It seems like the events of the past week and even this past weekend situate us in a different space. And I wanted just to start off by asking from some of your starting remarks around the context that we find ourselves in and how this relates especially to the work and the burden that many of the people in Aspire's network may feel, especially be given their responsibilities on their campus.
Chancellor Jones.
Dr. Malcolm, please.
It's really hard to really kind of wrap your mind around the kinds of things that you're dealing with. I think that you heard from Kimberly that I was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. And I am of an age that I experienced all of this. And I tell people this is not my first rodeo. In terms of the kinds of things that we're dealing with. I do, in fact, think that the kind of disruption that COVID-19 forced on all of us as higher education institution leaders, it's going to force us to basically rethink what we're doing. Our first reaction, one of my friends laid this out, was to react. We had to get our students into places of safety. We had to get our faculty into places of safety, but then we had to figure out how to run an institution in that space. And the next real big challenge is how do we return to the university? And the third one is to essentially reimagine what we're going to be returning to. Because quite frankly, it's not going to be business as usual. So we were already in this space of needing to reinvent and reimagine, just from COVID-19. And all of a sudden, we are thrust into this other space where we are reminded that this isn't just an issue anymore of trying to figure out how the institution has to work. It is a matter of calling upon the institution in a time that requires a moral imperative for reinvention. And that is, I think, the thing that will challenge us the most, to try to figure out how to do both of these things at the same time, even while all three of these issues are still existential issues for our institutions. So if we're going to already disrupt it, we might as well reimagine. And if we reimagine, we've got to reimagine in a way where diversity, equity, and inclusion are front and center on this reinvention.
Chancellor Jones?
Well, let me start by saying, first of all, good afternoon to everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity to be part of this dialogue. And like my colleague and friend, Dr. Malcolm, I'm also a product of the civil rights movement. I grew up between the peanut and cotton fields of southwestern Georgia, Terrell County, Dawson, Georgia, and really was fortunate enough to have a father and a mother who, notwithstanding the fact that they were sharecroppers, insisted that my brother and my sister and myself go to school and not miss a day out of school, harvesting the crops from the fields that we didn't own. And I didn't really think into my brain the impact of that to somewhat later in life, when I began to reflect on what a valuable contribution that was that helped shape my career, that my father had the courage to say to the landowner, my kids will not miss a day out of school to harvest crops. That took a lot of courage, as you might imagine, in the mid to late 50s. But anyway, these issues that we're contending with, both, let me start with the COVID-19 piece, is certainly something that I don't think any of us have had to contend with in the last 100 years. We're plowing new ground. We had to completely reinvent. And for my institution, in a matter of about 12 days, we had to completely rethink the operational aspect of this university. And it kind of brought to mind, some of the perspectives that I've learned from other leaders over time about what it means when you're thinking about having to create something new. And it really does provide a perspective that we're essentially, I think back to the founders of this university. I found myself in the same position that John Milton Gregory was back in 1866, when he was charged as a regent to think about creating the Industrial University of Illinois. And he has this famous quote that I'll just paraphrase. And it goes something like this: "This is no ordinary work we've been asked to do, and it comes under no ordinary set of circumstances." And that is what kind of frames my thinking each and every day that I get up and enter my Zoom room in my virtual environment. That lays the context for not only how we've had to reinvent ourselves in the midst of this pandemic, and now as we enter here in the state of Illinois into phase 3, where we were supposed to be going back to face-to-face operation today, but we had some looting and some unrest, and so we delayed it for a few days. But it is a time, as Shirley said, where we really have to take advantage of this moment to think about how we are going to have to reinvent higher education in terms of being a perfect blend and mixture of both face-to-face and online, with people working remotely who have the capacity to do so. How do we think more strategically about underserved populations who are the ones that are at greatest risk of being disenfranchised in the midst of having to learn remotely? And University of Illinois, like many of my peers, went above and beyond the call of duty to buy computers. And what's the use of a computer if you don't have a hotspot? And to buy hotspots and pay for that to make sure that our underserved population could continue their education online. But we firmly believe that higher education was built on the model of face-to-face, and that's the model that we like to get back to in the safest, most possible way, and that's what our plans are for the fall. But this has been just amazing in many ways. Never seen anything like it, but it is an opportunity. I look at every tragedy as an opportunity, and this is a big opportunity for higher education to step up in ways that it hasn't done before. And with the incidents of the last 7 days or so, as you heard from Kimberly's introduction, I spent 34 and a half years of my career at University of Minnesota. And so what happened in Minneapolis is something that really was very, very troubling to me personally. My wife was born and raised there. We have 2 kids still live there, 2 grandkids there, and even our kids that don't live there anymore were deeply troubled by what they saw transpired with the death of Mr. Floyd, as well as some of the actions that were taken in subsequent days. But again, this is another watershed moment for us to realize that what we have been doing in relationship to race, equity, and race relations has been necessary, but is clearly insufficient, because otherwise we wouldn't see these things playing out. And so our conversation has been around managing our institution through both of these crises, but just was on the phone with Sean Garrick, who is an engineer professor that I brought to Minnesota 22 years ago, who also lived in Minnesota for 22 years. The next action is, as an institution, how do we rethink what we've been doing and what we thought we knew about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really put in place a transformative strategy. So let me just stop there. I'm sorry if I went a little long, but these are very, very troubling times to have to deal with the pandemic. And now for the last 7 days or so, see a place that I love so dearly being ripped apart because of the senseless murder of an innocent soul in ways that I thought I'd never see play out in person or on national TV. It's just really one of the most unsettling things I've had to experience in my life. And I grew up in the South. you know, where hangings and lynchings were very, very common. But this is just a whole different level of hatred and frustration that's very, very perplexing. It makes you very angry, but it also makes me more determined that we've got to get this right from this point on.
Thank you both. So borrowing on that, from your lived experiences, especially the both of you as leaders, as scientists, and as African Americans living in these systems that both of you referenced, what do you think is most important for us to understand about the challenges of increasing faculty diversification and inclusion?
Most important. The problem is that we become parts of systems. We enter systems we did not create. We probably wouldn't have drawn them up like this, but we enter systems we didn't create. And those systems have certain traditions and processes and expectations that are attached to them. And some of them are good and they should be retained. And some of them are not so good and they need to be rethought. And I think that the notion of who is expected at the door when the door is opened, there are people who are considered quote unquote not typical and not traditional. I have been atypical and non-traditional everywhere I have gone. And you know, this notion of people don't expect to see you, and you know, to a certain extent, there's kind of, I mean, oxymoron in a lot of ways. An African-American woman scientist, that is multiply oxymoronic. But the major issue is that because you're not expected, people don't necessarily know what to do with you. So there's a certain amount of dissonance in terms of when you show up to a presentation for a possible hire. Okay. The real challenge right now is that we can't just get people from new hires. We have budget, all our institutions have budget problems. We had them before, but now post-COVID, we really have budget issues. And so the notion of how do we, in fact, bring people in, but importantly, how do we keep them? And retention has been a real problem up and down the line. So I will just mention those for you and let the Chancellor add to the list.
Well, I agree with everything that Dr. Malcom has said. There are still, notwithstanding that, you know, I've been at this for probably better part of 30 some odd years now, because I'm trained as a scientist, went to Minnesota, was in my lab minding my own business when a president of the university decided that I needed to offer some advice on how to make the university more equitable for particularly students of color. And so it was my first foray outside of my laboratory, where I was asked to start to help recruit more faculty of color. And I'm probably one of the few presidents of a university whose path to the presidency was first steeped in equity and diversity. I mean, that's how I first began to understand, because of what the president of the University of Minnesota asked me to do, the importance of this agenda. And it evolved not only to be my life's work, but I think which gave me the perspective that allowed me to become the chief executive officer of 2 research universities in the last 7 years now. But I can tell you, I think some of the challenges or there's been some progress, don't get me wrong. The fact that 25, 30 years ago, most universities decided to start to hire chief diversity officers. And I know you hear a lot in the press these days about the fact that these people are gonna be some of the first ones to go because of COVID-19 and institutions having to adjust their budget. I fundamentally hope that that's not true. I don't believe it to be true. But I think that made a lot of difference. I can tell you it made a lot of difference at the University of Minnesota because I managed that program for more than a decade. It made a difference at Albany, New York. It's made a profound difference here in Urbana-Champaign because it signals institutional commitment that equity and diversity is not at the core of what the institution is about. It's not at the margin. It really is at the core of what we do. And it's a strategic objective that deserves to be funded. It deserves to be monitored, and you have to have metrics and benchmarks to make sure you're getting a return on the investment. But I have seen that transform. If the institutional commitment isn't there, you can't expect the commitment to be at the level of the deans and where the rubber meets the road in the academic departments. And I've been around this work long enough to see how these efforts, if structured appropriately, can transform how promotion and tenure committees talk about candidates. First of all, recruit candidates of color. And then secondly, how they retain them. And thirdly, most importantly, how they advance them in the professions. Without those three pieces being seamlessly connected, you're only tweaking around the edges. And in some places, what Dr. Malcom was referring to, we do the recruitment because a lot of universities that you heard in the last 3 or 4 years, hundreds of millions of dollars dedicated to hire more faculty of color. But that's one thing to get them in the door. The second thing is how do you retain them and how do you provide them with the context to be successful in their academic disciplines? And so what we really need to do is to make that more seamless and to make this institutional priority that is core to what the strategic plan is for the institution.
Absolutely.
Chancellor, oh yeah, thank you. Chancellor Jones, I have a follow-up question for you. It oftentimes seems that institutional priorities can unfortunately easily waver, especially from DEI work. And I'm wondering how you might suggest for those of us engaged in this particular work, how might we maintain momentum on these issues, especially right now, given in light of the current disruptions and opportunities, as you've pointed out, that institutional leaders and stakeholders have before them?
Well, that's a critically important question because we all know each of our institutions, regardless of your size, whether you have a $1 billion endowment or a 10 or no $1 billion endowment, we all are facing significant financial challenges and in some places hundreds of millions of dollars. It will be the easy thing to do is to start to think about what you were cut in order to keep what is called, and this is where the core piece comes in. You don't cut what's at the core of the institution.
Right.
And I made it very, very clear that one of the things we will not be cutting at the University of Illinois is equity and diversity and public engagement. Because I can tell you those two entities, if we have the best opportunity in higher education to really prioritize, invest strategically in those areas, because it's our only real chance to resolve some of the racism and the hatred, but also to demonstrate the value proposition of higher education that a lot of people have lost sight of. Yes, an education, a college degree is not for everybody, but it's still as critically important now as it was 50 years ago, 150 years ago. And so I think what you hopefully will do is remember that it is at the core and help those entities that you're involved with demonstrate that. I'm a very strong believer, if you want to know what I value, follow the money.
Right.
And
Right.
you're not continuing to invest in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the engagement element of that is the embodiment of the expertise that we have on campus to take our knowledge into community, to not solve the problems the university think is important, but to solve those problems that diverse, underserved communities have clearly identified as important. That's how you protect, that's how you secure this as a core strategy. If it's not at the core, then it will be on the cutting room floor before you can blink an eye.
You're absolutely right. One of the things that I have never heard science, follow the science, do the science so much in my life as during this whole time where people, governors and mayors and elected officials and what have you, are talking about, we got to trust in the science. We've got to get this underway. That's an opportunity in and of itself, because we have people who are out there that the demand is high. So that's one element. But then we have also had a demonstration in terms of like the disparities that in fact, that it does not in fact hit every different population in the same way. So Chancellor Jones is right on in terms of his admonition that we have to really kind of take hold of these things when the opportunities present themselves.
Yeah, thank you both for those comments. I think it's especially poignant given the work that we do in Aspire. Dr. Malcom, I wonder if you might help us think through our next question, which is really about how we approach this work from a systems perspective. I know the work that you and your colleagues at AAAS, who's a partner, national partner of Aspire's Alliance, have thought a lot about the systemic piece too. And I know that you've spent decades helping institutional leaders think about the organizational structures and systems that have to be in place to really effectively support individuals. Can you share with us some more about how you think about this systems approach?
Yes, I'm honored to do so. I've read old speeches I gave 30 years ago, and I took it in, and I find myself asking for a systemic approach in 35 years ago. And it's like only now have we been able to really realize how to operationalize that. Okay, and that's the point I think that is really critical to all of us. How do we operationalize this thing that we value, and that is to come at this as a systems approach. When Kimberly introduced you, I think that she introduced that my PhD is in ecology. I was trained as an ecologist to think about systems. And so now I have an opportunity to kind of bring all these pieces together. Institutions have things that in fact keep the parts in place and interacting with each other. They have policies, they have processes, they have procedures, they have programs, they have practices, they have traditions. You've got to look at every single one of those in terms of what their impact that they have on the different populations that you're trying to serve. And until you can do that, and until you can unpack this and begin to understand how each group is actually experiencing the institution, you're not going to be able to get that. That's one of the things that we have built into Sea Change. This idea of helping institutions go through self-assessment that unpack the policies, programs, practices, procedures, traditions, etc., that they can begin to understand how these may be affecting different groups from a metrics-driven process. And that's the other part that is absolutely clear, that if you don't count it, you won't find it. And so looking at this, going through a self-assessment, moving from a self-assessment into a period of reflection. What do these numbers mean? What do the data mean from the climate surveys, et cetera? And then putting together a plan of action. This is for the awards process that we have developed for Sea Change. And that's the part we tested out first. However, we in fact believe that we've got to have a community that has this conversation, just the way you do in Aspire. You have got to be able to join together to kind of share what is different approaches that may be taking. But the other part is you have to be able to offer people training. You have to be able to offer them the research put in a modular way that they can begin to understand the implications of that work for them, for their institutions, for the choices that they're making within their institution. And I think that kind of a very regular process to help institutions go through this process, but at the end of the day, to receive some kind of public recognition for the fact that they have gone through this process and that they are places that are engaged in the reimagining and the hard work of systems change. That is, I think, a really critical aspect.
Thank you. Chancellor Jones, I know you have been integrally involved in the helping plan the work with the National Science Foundation that led to the Includes portfolio coming about. And I wonder if you might share with us, I think you've spoken about this idea of thinking beyond individual actors and institutions towards more of a system approach in what the National Science Foundation has attempted and what we are trying to work on in our alliance with Aspire, which is why we engage multiple institutional types. We talk about 2-year institutions, 4-year institutions, faculty, administrators, and different geographic regions. And I wonder if you might speak to some of the genesis that came out of, or that led to NSF's Includes whole portfolio. Aspire is one of 7 alliances, right, and of many, many dozens of pilots. Aspire grew out of 2 Includes, or 3 Includes pilots, right, to come here. And wonder if you might share some of that insight.
Sure, Travis, be happy to. Let me just start by first of all saying this conversation that we're focusing now on in terms of system and institutional change and integrating across many different entities is our only way to really start to have lasting and sustainable impact. It's just not going to happen because 1,000 points of light that's not integrated will not show you the way to the future and will not get you to where you need to be. And so I was very, very proud of the fact that during the 5-year period that I had the great pleasure of serving on CEOS, the committee, congressionally appointed Committee on Equal Opportunity in Science and Engineering, this notion went beyond just a big focus at that time was broader impact. And I can tell you that's huge. NSF did an amazing job of making sure that PIs, regardless of the program that you were applying for, had some kind of broader impact goal and strategy as a part of grants. And I can tell you for folks in STEM careers or social sciences, it really doesn't matter. That was a very, very big additional piece of this system that needed to be there to assure that that grant proposals and the distribution of resources was part of this system as well. To get money in the hands of these folks that we were trying to recruit to our faculty, to give them the resources they need in order to be successful and providing opportunities for that to happen. Because I can tell you it's kind of magic in some ways, how many grant proposals I wrote in the first maybe couple of years of my tenure track position at University of Minnesota. It wasn't until I had a chance to sit on a panel, NSF, USDA panel, that I really began to understand what this grant writing thing was all about. And all of a sudden, then I could write a grant proposal that was funded. It wasn't magic. It was just clearly having the inside knowledge of how to be successful. And then the NSF component of broader participation really made fair and equitable access to sponsored research, which is critically important in STEM careers and many other social sciences and education careers as well. And so this led to the Aspire initiative, what I think is kind of another way of broadening that institutional strategy, to get institutions to think differently, to come together and create what I think is critically important collective impact, working from a common platform of principles, guiding principles and strategies so that we all will benefit from it, I think is one of the most strategic things that have been done in quite some time. And I was deeply honored when Dr. Malcom approached my institution and our dear friend, Dr. Wanda Ward, who I had the great pleasure of stealing away from NSF a couple of years ago to come work with me. We're very pleased to be part of Sea Change as well, because that we're proud to be an anchor in that whole initiative and to be one of the inaugural members. Shirley, thank you for the opportunity. And we look forward to this being another addition, another extension of that systematic approach that sooner or later, if you've got all of these systematic things kind of lined up, then you can start to see some real sustainable progress. Right. And right. One of the things we haven't talked a lot about, we have to do the same kind of thing. And I'm going to get on my K through 12 early childhood education soapbox here for a minute. Because I can tell you, given what we are seeing roll out in our country today, not only just the domestic issues of racism and inequality, but the international things that are playing out on the international stage that clearly is going to impact the mobility of foreign talent that has really helped make right. this country what it is today in terms of innovation. If that continues down the path it is going, it's going to put a greater sense of urgency that we really cannot afford to leave a whole segment of our society behind. We can't leave women behind. We can't leave people of color behind in terms of access to STEM education, innovation kinds of careers. And we've got to think about strategies. We keep, I stopped talking about the pipeline. I don't think I've right. used that word until now, about 5 years ago. But we really do need to think about how do we make more of our domestic population college ready. It scares me when I look at the demographics in terms of the declining number of students of color, particularly from our high schools. I look at the graduation rates in some of our institutions. And so we're going to have to think about that part of the system as well. And we cannot afford to leave that behind. And we're very, very proud of a thing that we started here in Illinois called the Illinois Commitment. And I know a lot of our institutions are doing it, but I can tell you it's the most important thing we've done, where we have provided free tuition from any student from a family that makes $67,000 or less to the University of Illinois. Now, you got to meet the criteria to get in. We didn't lower the criteria, but we provided the financial access to a world-class education. And I would encourage all of our higher educations, because this national dialogue about free tuition, I think, has a place, but it has to be managed in the context of each and every university. But we have to think about that piece of the institutionalized system as well. We can't do all our work upstream of the problem. We got to go, I always get this confused. We got to go down to the source. We got to go down yes. to the source at the very early stages of this and be very, very thoughtful about what is the role of higher education and educational access and equity. And, trying to fix the problem on the back end just doesn't work. It hasn't worked. It won't work in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to make sure that we have time for our audience. Our audience's Q&A has been coming in. And so I'm going to shift because I know that we want them to get some of their questions answered as well. So Kimberly Griffin is going to facilitate that area. I'm moving.
My pleasure. Thank you so much to both of you for all of your comments. I have a page full of notes here, and I wish that I could have my own conversation with both of you. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to ask a question from the audience. So our first question is, how might institutions, you both mentioned retention, how might institutions manage keeping faculty of color and other underrepresented faculty when they are located in cities, sometimes small cities that are not very ethnically diverse? I was a faculty member at one of those institutions for several years, so I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I got my PhD from Penn State, so we can talk about Happy Valley anytime you want to, okay? All right. But the issue is that I think that we have to find community. And that is a matter that an institution can really help you find community. This isn't a thing of You've got to have some place to go and party. I'm not the partying person. The major point is that you have to find professional opportunity. You have to find colleagueship. You've got to be able to know that you can get done what you need to get done in terms of your own aspirations and your research, but that you can do it in an environment where you are respected and where you are supported. And I think that those kinds of things, people are willing to go to wherever. I mean, I go to wherever, and I have been to wherever, and I do think that I've found lots of people of color there, for example. But they have to be able to feel as though they belong there. And that is the critical issue, belonging.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Jones?
I won't, Shirley, you're spot on. And it's the sense of belonging, because I can tell you in 1978, when I arrived at the University of Minnesota, even though it's a larger, more metropolitan kind of environment, there was not a large number of people that looked like me at the university. But I can tell you what kept me there for 34 and a half years was the deep sense of collegiality that I found in my department. I can tell you, it was an amazing experience. Unfortunately, you know, not all of my colleagues had the same kind of experience at their institutions that I did, but it was amazing how I was embraced as just another faculty member who was hired to do incredible work at the same level of expectation, and was provided the resources to be successful. And when I built the faculty recruitment and retention program at the University of Minnesota back in the mid to early 90s, I kept that at the forefront of my mind, that what we have to try to do is to try to make sure each and every faculty member that we hire find that sense of place, that sense of connection, that sense of ownership and being a member of the community. And then on the promotion and tenure side, as I said earlier, how do you work with departments to understand that if this person's work is on equity and diversity, that work has to be viewed at the core of the academic unit, not something at the margins. And that's how you get, that's the sticking power, that's the staying power. When people are in an environment where they feel valued, they are nurtured, their work is valued, and they are made to feel like they are a critical part of what's going on at the institution, regardless of whether you're a community size of Happy Valley or Urbana-Champaign or Minneapolis-St. Paul. You stay because you know you're part of something grand. And I was really gratified to get here to this university and find such a large number of highly regarded, significantly funded African Americans in STEM disciplines who are getting funding from NSF. I mean, these folks are heavy hitters. And yes, a small community, but they are here because of the sense of belonging, and the reputation of the institution is the kind of place they want to be a part of.
Thank you so much. And I think y'all both just hit it right on the head from my experience too, that sense of belonging meant everything, and having community. So whatever we can do to help institutions realize that and help center that for their faculty is really important. I want to ask, I think we have time for one more question from the audience, and it speaks to some of the comments Chancellor Jones made earlier about thinking about pathways. So the comment speaks to community colleges. Come here, baby boy. Sorry, my son wants to make it.
Got a Zoom bomber, look at her.
We have a Zoom bomber. Given the community college context, right, that 41% of all US undergraduates, 39% of all first-time freshmen, 57% of Native Americans, 57% of Latinx students, 42% of Black students, and 39% of Asian Pacific Islander students are all taking classes at community colleges. What strategies would you suggest for attracting faculty from underrepresented groups to teaching at our institutions? In terms of attracting students to and retaining students in STEM disciplines, this is an important and often neglected segment of higher education.
A number of years ago, I chaired the National Academies Committee looking at barriers and opportunities to 2-year and 4-year STEM degrees. and had an opportunity at that time to really kind of see those pathways, because that's what you're talking about, pathways. And sometimes it is a lot easier for students to enter those pathways via two-year institutions. They may be more geographically there. They may be more, they may be cheaper. They may fit the time frame of a person who's working, who's older, all kinds of things to regard. I think, though, that the major part is to invite people. That essentially that you help them understand where they fit into the kind of whole higher education framework. And I do think that since you can teach at a two-year institution, there are many more master's degree holding STEM people who might like to consider two-year institutions than heavy-duty PhD research intended people among the STEM people, STEM graduates of color. And so it's a matter of really finding and inviting, giving people an opportunity to see what those classrooms and what those individuals look like, the kinds of aspirations that they have for their own future. I think that those kinds of things, to show me the opportunity, would in fact be very attractive to a lot of people. It's just that you've got to know about it. It even includes people who are mid-career. They may have been working in industry or with government. They want to make a shift. They've decided that they really want to kind of come into this education space. That's a great place to look and see whether there are things that they know and know how to do that would really be appreciated within a two-year college setting.
Absolutely. Dr. Jones.
Well, just briefly, Shirley, I couldn't agree more. I think community colleges are a very, very important pathway. Let me just share, since I share stories about Minnesota and Illinois, I give equal time to SUNY Albany. When I arrived there in 2013 as the president of SUNY Albany, I was absolutely floored when my first graduation, which was about 4 or 5 months later after I started. And we graduated a significant number of students. And I was blown away when one of my vice presidents said to me, or I asked a question, how many of these students actually started at SUNY Albany that are actually graduating today? And he said, well, let me put the answer to you this way. Only about 48% of those students that are going to be graduating today actually started out at one of the community colleges. 48%. And so I use that as an example of how we have to have a seamless relationship between community colleges and four-year universities. Because, to be honest with you, SUNY Albany there's a deep understanding in the state of New York throughout the whole community college system. There's a great, deep sense of understanding among the general public that is the best way for many of the students to start their education. And it's not just because it's more affordable, or for a lot of them, it just gives them the time to figure out what they want to be, what they want to major in. And so why not go to one of the area community colleges as a way of getting that done? And I think and so it's another example of the importance of this seamless relationship. Universities have to have seamless articulation agreement with community colleges. And I can tell you, particularly in some of the STEM disciplines, is going to be the only way we're going to be able to increase the diversity that we talk about. It's the only way it's going to happen. And Dr. Malcom is right. I think that we're at a point in time now where folks that have been professionals could be highly attracted, or someone just coming out of school to go to work at one of these colleges, because they are absolutely fundamentally important component of higher education. And I think sometimes we lose track of that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We have one last question that we would love for you folks to reflect on. And I know we're running close up on time, but I feel like we can't leave without asking you this one last question. So, you know, we're at this critical moment, and earlier I jotted down, Dr. Malcom, you said, if we're going to disrupt, we might as well reimagine. And Dr. Jones, you talked about systems change is really the only way forward, right? That we can't just keep tweaking around the margins. We really need to make some fundamental changes. So thinking outside of the box, what is one thing that we are not thinking about in terms of promoting transformation, and how can we be better innovators?
I know.
For me, the one thing that I think that we're not, well, I'll put two things we're not thinking about. One is the fact of that Dr. Jones, Chancellor Jones already mentioned, and that is that we can't just think inside of the institution, and we can't just think institution to institution. We've got to look at the opportunities that come from the community, from the questions that come from the community, from the science that the community needs. My old high school is sitting on a brownfield site, Superfund site, okay? Our communities have questions. Our communities have needs, and they don't know that the science is actually needed in order to address their needs. So remove some of those barriers between the institution and the community, remove some of the barriers between the institutions and industry and businesses. How can we in fact begin to be a lot more porous in our work with government, in our work with nonprofits and what have you in the process of building community. And the other major thing is that of governance. I am a trustee of one institution or region of another. And I know that in many cases, our trustees don't really, in fact, always understand the business of higher education. The business within higher education, yes, but in terms of the kind of what is the role that we're supposed to play within the larger community, society, et cetera, and how to go about that, I think that that's absolutely critical. And to the extent that we can get regents and trustees on board, we can sustain this work, because we tend to serve a lot longer than CEOs and presidents. Okay, so the whole question is part of sustainability is to embed these DEI messages and mission also within our governance.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones.
That's a tough question, but let me just leave you with this last thought. From my perspective, the one thing that I think we are not doing enough of, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that I think leaders of higher education institutions need to take a greater sense of ownership of K through 12 education. I can't sit here in my so-called lofty position as the chancellor of one of the finest research universities in the world and complain about or point fingers at the inequities and the gaps in the experience of kids in our K through 12 system. I just don't know how you can lead a university these days and not work very closely with the state K through 12 education department on issues that run the gamut from teacher training. On one hand, how do you train teachers to teach in more diverse audiences so we can get more kids that are not afraid of taking that chemistry class, or who can be successful in math or some of the other anchor courses. But so that's one piece. Institutional leadership has to really take some ownership. And I don't mean ownership, but ownership to step out and partner with K through 12 education to take this on as a responsibility and not sit on the sidelines complaining. Right. And the other piece of it, the community engagement piece, I can tell you that is extremely valuable, because as you know, our kids spend quite a bit of their time outside of the formal classroom. And I've seen programs like STEMNOLA, and I don't know if you heard of STEMNOLA or not. It was started by a guy named Dr. Kevin Mikey, who was a displaced engineer at Tulane University when Katrina came through. this has become Kelvin's love and his passion. And I have participated in this program down in New Orleans on a Saturday morning that was packed with 450 some 6 to 8, 10, 12, 13-year-olds, with people from Houston, from NASA, and all the big aviation and electronic companies volunteering their time to come out to help these young kids and young girls get hooked on science by making rockets out of paper towel rolls and just all kinds of innovative stuff. So much so that I've invested some money here in Illinois to bring that program to the University of Illinois, because it's a critical engagement piece and it's our way of engaging with K through 12 education outside of the formal classroom, as a way of getting more young people, more females interested in STEM related disciplines. And we're going to call it STEM Illinois. And it had not been for COVID-19, it would be up and running right now, but we're going virtual with it for the next several months. So I think, you know, working with K through 12 in a partnership and then deep community engagement projects are a critical path forward.
Thank you to both of you. Again, I'm so inspired. Listen, I could just pull my baby and a snack up and listen to you both all day. So thank you so much for your comments.
We can talk about preschool science if you want.
Listen, I'll email you. I need all that. I need all that. So I'll turn it back over to Travis. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Kimberly. Great.
Yeah, I echo Kimberly's thanks to both of you on behalf of all of our Aspire colleagues and coordinators. We're just so thankful for your time with us today, and thank you for your, not only your amazing kind of lessons, and also your just continued support of our project and the work that we're doing. I have to apologize for letting somebody else upstage you, but Kimberly's son is just too amazing not to get him in the video a little bit. So thank you all again. And we very much appreciate your efforts and your support of us. To all of our summit participants and attendees, thank you so much for a hard day's work. We know that there's a lot going on, and your time spent with us is incredibly valuable. We know there are many demands on your time and many demands from your fellow institutions and colleagues at your institution, where you wear many hats, and especially right now are probably being called upon. We look forward to engaging with you tomorrow and Wednesday. Thank you again, and we're sorry that we ran a little long today. I, like Kimberly, could chat with these amazing folks for hours if I had the opportunity. So we just wanted to thank you. If you have any questions, I'll stick around here in the webinar for a moment in case you have questions about kicking things off tomorrow. You'll start in your tracks. So if anybody needs help finding where you're headed tomorrow, we're happy to help with that. So thank you again to our keynote speakers, and thank you to all of you for joining us.